The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everybody. This is Ruby, and welcome to the webinar. And Cheryl will introduce our speakers today.
Hi, everybody. It's Cheryl Grant. We have Danica, Petroshius, and Marchione from the Penn Hill Group joining us today. I hope everybody got a chance to read a little bit about the work that they do in the email that got sent out. I'm going to move it on over to them, but I just wanted to let you know that they gave a presentation a little while ago that I attended, and they had such rich, useful information that I thought, for those of you who are leading thinkers and innovators in this area, that this is probably something that is going to be of benefit to you. So please ask lots of questions, and you can do that through the GoToMeeting platform or in Chatzy, and I'll let them take it from here.
Great, thanks, Cheryl. This is Danica first, and we're getting the slides set up. Just a really quick recap to give you a big picture. Sorry, I'm a little distracted. I'll let them figure it out. To give a big picture, we are a team here at Penn Hill Group that predominantly focuses on federal education policy, politics, and we in the form of consulting and lobbying. And what specifically for the MacArthur Foundation we've been working on is really trying to take all of the big pieces that you all in Badges or in Connected Learning have been working on and trying to translate them into policy. And as you'll see as we go through today, sometimes that translation happens in the form of somebody, takes initiative and we go forward and do it, and sometimes it's matching what's happening in policy with what's happening in practice and trying to find linkages, which is really where we see the Badges conversation today. And as I mentioned in one of the meetings I was with Cheryl, is that there's a friend of ours always says that the real change in how we work policy is when preparation meets opportunity. And I think if you think about that as the backdrop, whether you're looking for funding or you're looking to widen policy at the local, state, or federal level so that there's more opportunity for this kind of work, you really have to do a lot of legwork and think about how your work can be translated, even if you don't always talk about it the same way. Learning to talk the way other people talk about these things to make those connections is when all of this is going to happen. So I just want to give you a little backdrop on that, and Kara's going to kick us off talking about Congress first, so we have some context here.
Hi, everyone. We wanted to start with talking a little bit about the big picture in Congress, because there's a few things that are helpful to know as you're looking, at federal policy and where things stand with Congress and the administration right now. In both the Senate and the House, one thing to note is that there are fewer members with experience in passing major legislation. Part of this is because a lot of new members are coming in. A lot of the old members have either retired or been voted out, and so you don't have those great stalwarts of the House and Senate as you have in the past. And part of that was due to gerrymandered House districts. And a problem with the gerrymandering was also that it nearly eliminated all of the moderates in Congress. So right now you have a lot of members who are at the far right and a lot of members who are at the left, and very few who can meet in the middle. And because of the strong partisan divides, we've seen problems with the procedure of the House and the Senate. So I thought it would be helpful to explain kind of what the procedure is first. You have both appropriators and authorizers in Congress. And on appropriations, the procedure, and this is similar to what authorizers do as well, but each appropriations committee introduces a bill and marks up their appropriation bills. And what that means, the term mark up, means that the appropriation bills go through the committee. And during the committee process, there's an opportunity for members to amend the bill, which is called marking up the bill. Once the bills pass out of the committee, they would pass both in the House and the Senate. They move to, and it doesn't have to happen at the same time, it can happen at different times on the calendar. and they move to then the House or the Senate floor. And there's then floor debate and another opportunity for members to amend the bill and make changes. Then, if you're following regular procedure, the bills then pass off of the House and Senate floor, and they move to what's called a conference. And during this conference, you have conferees who are appointed from both the House and the Senate, who then work to negotiate a deal between the two bills. So there'll be differing bills between the House and the Senate. They work together to come to a compromise, which is then the conference report. The conference report is then voted on in both the House and the Senate. So that's regular procedure. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much of regular procedure. With appropriations bills, we haven't really gotten many out of committee and then hardly any off the floor to be signed into law. Instead, we've seen a lot of continuing resolutions, which means that Congress votes to continue the appropriations from the previous year as opposed to negotiating out new terms and a new bill. We've also seen some omnibus legislation, which means they take what they have passed out of committee and on the floor, group them together in one big bill that's called an omnibus, and both the House and the Senate vote on that legislation. The authorizing is the same procedure with the committee and the House and Senate floor and being signed into law. We haven't seen much movement on that end of things either, and what has been happening is that a little bit of the policy changes have been made on the appropriations bill, or attempted to be made, because a lot of them haven't passed, as we just discussed. And what that means is you take the authorizing language, which is the policy language, and you can put it into the appropriations bills, which are the funding bills. That is not regular order, but it has been done in a few cases. We also know that now in Congress, the rank and file members have little or no influence anymore. So as I talked about the process and the amending process and moving the bills from committee to the floor, a lot of that is already pre-negotiated with leadership, and they really have the voice in moving legislation right now. And because of all these problems with Congress, both the House and the Senate, we've got gridlock. And with gridlock, the administration has been taking matters into its own hands. And what that means is they've been putting out new regulations. They've had waivers of certain policy, including the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And they've had grant programs that were largely tailored to their priorities.
And I think that Danica, again, I think that the most important reason to go through some of these really basic things that might, to you, sound like Schoolhouse Rock type of thing, but it's really important because as we talk about the policy trends next, as we're seeing them as they relate to opportunities for all of you with badges, it's really important to understand that that you can no longer sort of go to the regular process or know where to go exactly for where decisions are made. And in fact, they're being made in many different places, and they're not being made in any sort of organized way. And so this sort of notion of being prepared and meeting that with opportunity is really more critical than ever, as opposed to trying to take an idea and continue to pound at it over time and move it through a process. So some of the policy trends that we've seen that we think are really important for all of you to understand and to really capture and work on is partnerships and capacity building. We'll explain each of these a little more. Digital infrastructure needs and personalized learning. So the first one we want to sort of focus on is partnerships and capacity building. The notion historically on why all of these sort of things, why this is needed is in the last 10 years or so, with No Child Left Behind being passed in 2001 under George Bush, which most of you have heard of, which is really known for strict accountability at the federal level and testing grades 3 through 8 each year, that there's been a backlash against that sort of broadly, but also there's been a rejuvenation of interest in a new kind of workforce and training, with the economy having also sort of tanked during that time. And all of those things have changed the education debate. So not only is there reaction to the traditional No Child Left Behind scheme of accountability and people wanting to find ways to have different measures of accountability and measuring more than just reading and math, but also sort of these 21st century skills. But you also see challenges because the business community is demanding much different and higher workforce skills. Common Core state standards are raising standards, and the adoption of those in most of the states means that you're going to see almost immediately, and we know this from Georgia, who implemented this in the short run as a pilot, you see an immediate drop in not only test scores but graduation rates, and everything falls out because when you set the standard higher, everyone's got to reach higher to get them. And so there's a lot of concern and demand and interest in other ways to solve these issues. Coursework rigor has to go up in relation to Common Core, and then there is a non-ending and continuing scrutiny over graduation rate accountability, and that is something that has not changed federally and has been consistent and only getting tighter. And that sort of urgency to graduate more students or all students on time, meeting the higher Common Core standards, all of that sort of begs for more of everything. And two things that we feel that people have been talking about in reaction to that are partnerships, capacity building. And around capacity building, it's really that they sort of work together, that schools are highly important in our educational system, but with all of those demands, I think fewer and fewer people believe that they can do this alone, and that with the sort of demand for 21st century skills to be understood and developed better, that we have to change how we do business. So there's a lot more focus on internal capacity around, you've seen issues like teacher effectiveness growing and the need for teachers to have more competencies addressed. Also, both in the Department of Education and the Obama administration's work, as well as in policy that we've seen coming out of the House and Senate, and in sort of bills that are being pushed along, there is much more interest in outside organizations partnering with schools, and that is both on educational as well as other than more of the 21st century skills and engagement that people need. That is for both the interest that we need more time to do all of it, but also that there are specific skills or capacities that the school is not going to have in that community that can be filled by somebody else. That's a huge opportunity for badges. We'll talk about that more later. So all of those things are growing in interest. I would have said, if we had this talk 5 years ago, I would have said you're not going to see much of that, or I guess pre-Obama, I should say, pre-Obama, that there's no interest in this. And post-Obama, though Obama is not necessarily equally supportive of all of these things I've talked about, that between Congress and the Obama administration, we've seen a resurgence of interest in this with sort of the notion that it didn't work when we asked schools to do it alone. Another area that obviously is really important to the work that we're all doing is digital infrastructure needs. And there's a lot of things going on right now, and I wanted to give a little history because I think it's fascinating. We created this chart here internally because we thought it was really important for people to understand where we've come. We use the word digital now, but technology, 15, I guess now, years ago was the phrase. And while the E-rate has withstood the test of time, and we'll talk in a little bit how that has to be updated, every other really focused funding for education technology-related things has gone by the wayside, except for Ready to Learn program, which is about $27 million and is predominantly for public broadcasting early education work, which I know that there's some of those folks on the phone here. But it's fascinating because if you look back when No Child Left Behind had passed, there were billions of dollars being spent on education technology in schools and related communities, organizations. And at that point, everything's gone to zero except that 27 million. So to us, that says something, and we've had a dormant conversation. There wasn't really a fight against it. People sort of let it happen. It wasn't an outcry. And until maybe a couple of years ago when Obama announced the ARPA Ed proposal, which we'll talk about, this new E-rate thing, some of his race to top pieces, I3, suddenly there's a resurgence in interest in digital aspects of things, and that is, the pendulum has swung all the way down, and now it's swung all the way up again, and we're on the climb up for issues around digital, I think.
So as Danica mentioned, we're on the way up in terms of digital issues, and one of the programs that was proposed by the Obama administration is ARPA Ed, and this is a program that's modeled after the Department of Defense DARPA program, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And the purpose of this, it's intended to fund innovative, out-of-the-box ideas with the potential to transform teaching and learning. And it was proposed by the Obama administration to be funded out of the I3 program, which is the Investing in Innovation program. The uncertainties here are it would be a new program, so it's unclear whether it would actually improve student achievement, and it's also unclear whether it would actually get funding given some of the fiscal realities in Congress right now.
One of the things that, just so you sort of see the trend of this that's happened, is that originally the Obama administration proposed it as its own standalone program, which would require a whole new funding for, quote, new programs, which is an unpopular policy trend. People don't want to fund new programs. And then most recently, the Obama administration put it as a carve-out of the I3 program, which already exists, making the likelihood, if there ever were an appropriations bill that was new, the likelihood of a carve-out of it being in there much more likely, because it's not creating a new program, it's sort of a set-aside or carve-out within another program. And the interesting part about that is that ARPA Ed itself is, I mean, I've never seen anything like this proposed in education. It's purely for technology, like literally the digital technology. It really wants it to create the next, you know, iPhone for education, whatever it is. So it's their idea anyway is very much that business corporations partner with others to do this work. So it's a very different thing. People don't really know what it would look like within the Department of Ed, because the Department of Ed is not set up to be that freewheeling and loose on its sort of let's try something really new and see what happens, and if it fails, it fails, which is very DARPA-like. So people are very interested in what will happen to that. Senator Bennett from Colorado has taken an interest in it, and at least on the policy side, has supported policy moving forward in that area. But there hasn't, other than that, been a huge outpouring around it, except for the administration seems to be very interested in if there were an appropriations bill, they would probably fund it.
Right. And then again, kind of on this uptrend of focus on digital and digital infrastructure, the administration has put out a proposal called Connect Ed, and it focuses on 3 issues: upgrading connectivity, and the goal, according to the administration, is to connect 99% of America's students to the digital age through next generation broadband and high-speed wireless, and this is a program for schools and libraries. It's called E-rate. The second goal of Connect Ed is training teachers, so improving the skills of teachers and ensuring that teachers and educators have the professional development for using technology and improving student learning. And then the third purpose of Connect Ed is encouraging private sector innovation, and the goal is producing feature-rich educational devices that are price competitive with basic textbooks. What's interesting is the focus on this Connect Ed proposal really came out of the movement towards Common Core state standards, as Danica had mentioned before, and those standards will be tied to assessments, and the assessments are all digital. They have to be digital within 3 years. And so as the states began working on the implementation of these standards and the assessments, they were realizing that they don't have the digital infrastructure to support the needs. And so the president now, the administration has taken notice and for the first time in a long time are proposing changes to E-rate. And there's been some proposals in the past, but they've always kind of not moved forward on them. So now the FCC, who has jurisdiction over these issues, is expected to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking on E-rate. There's actually a meeting at the FCC on an open meeting on Friday to discuss the NPRM.
And part of the interesting sort of trajectory of this digital infrastructure piece we've been talking about is there was sort of, as you saw, people sort of shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, no more funding for education technology over those past 10 years, previous 10 years, I should say, or post-2001, that there was this sort of notion that the digital divide or the need, because we connected all these schools with the initial E-rate, has sort of stopped, and that we've fixed it. And it's true that there is broadband in all the schools of some kind, but we know that in most cases it's not as powerful enough at all to handle the kind of infrastructure needs that not only of Common Core, but the kinds of things that we're all talking about here, but also that there is not only just training the teachers, but I think that within the connected learning broadly and Badges community, there's really an understanding that when you're talking about digital education related things, that it's really there's going to be a next generation of digital divide. Even if you were to do Connect Ed and everyone got the high speed broadband and capacity they needed, there's cultural and practice shifts that need to happen to make it real that is much more difficult. It's not just how you use a computer, which certainly is a challenge in a lot of schools still. There are still computer labs, so you'll see on Department of Ed data, every school has computers, or 98% or something like that. But the reality is a lot of those are sitting in one classroom, locked during the summer, locked after school, only used by certain teachers, that it's both cultural as well as capacity of how to use these digital technologies. So that's a challenge that I'm sort of raising, because I think that as we think about anytime, anywhere learning and the offerings of Badges, these are real challenges that we're just on the brink of beginning to understand and address. So another interesting trend is personalized learning, which has been bantered about forever in sort of the digital education technology movement. But personalized learning, interestingly enough, has been also talked about in many different ways in the special education, disability community, in other communities that are just talking about education reform and every child should have its own plan. So when Race to the Top district grants came out by the administration, again, they wrote the policy. There was no real hill. Congress did not have an imprint on this policy. They designed something, and they had a component of it that suggested that personalized learning should be included. And of interest is that there are a lot of folks around our world who looked at that and said, oh, this is fantastic. The administration is focusing on students with disabilities. Other folks said, oh, man, are they pushing like an individual plan for every student that gets them from, pre-K through graduation and sets a course for them? And then there was a different set of folks who said, oh, finally, they're going to support digital stuff. And it was fascinating because because they didn't define it in the grant, they just said personalized learning, and there was no real broader definition or understanding. It was all over the map what people understood. But the digital community understood that some of us who are in this deep understood the administration was using personalized learning for code for digital learning. And so most of the grants are doing something in that way. So again, this is one of those areas where you're talking about who's talking about what and how important language is. personalized learning agendas are a great place to think about when we think about digital badges and other things like it. That the movement towards that, this is one of the solutions that we're seeing out there. And so those Race to the Top grants are out there. They've been granted. There's second round? I can't remember. There's second round. Yeah, there's second round coming, or they've applied, but they haven't gotten them. And so that's another. It just shows another trend that's on the up slide that aligns to all of this.
So we talked a little bit broadly about kind of all of the different components that start building a positive atmosphere for learning anytime, anywhere, connected learning, badges. And all of this is showing us that federal policy is beginning to support the idea of badges, the idea of digital and digital infrastructure. Some specific examples of this are the Department of Education currently has a badge study. It's out of the Office of Vocational and Adult Education. It's called OVE. And they are looking to investigate the feasibility of a badging system for adult education. So this will be interesting. This study is currently underway, and the results could really open up a lot of opportunities. The other example at Department of Ed is that they're endorsing competency-based learning at institutions of higher education. So the Department of Ed recently put out a letter talking about direct assessments and how students could receive financial aid, federal financial aid, for competency-based learning outside of the traditional kind of Carnegie unit clock and calendar. And that basically means that right now the system is set up so that you're learning at institutions, and based on your classes and the time spent in the seat and learning and the assessments provided through the school, you're gaining credit. But this competency-based learning is really saying that the learning that's happening outside of the traditional institutions of higher education can get credit, and that students can receive financial aid for that. And then in Congress, we talked a lot about the gridlock in Congress, but even there is some early explorations of work that could support badges. One is the industry-based, industry-recognized credentials. In the House passed WIA, which is the Workforce Investment Act, and this version was called the Skills Act. The legislation specifically allowed for industry-recognized credentials, and that is a big deal, not because it spells out badges, not because it overtly says badges, but it does mean that there's an opportunity for badges to become the industry-recognized credential. So I know you all are doing a lot of work with industry and looking at the needs of industry and how individuals can get badges to demonstrate the skills and achievements that they have acquired through job training programs or on-the-job training. And these are really new opportunities that could be possible through federal legislation. There could be some support there. However, as we mentioned earlier, there's that gridlock, so WIA has not passed either the House or the Senate. It did come out of committee, but it hasn't. In the House it did. It went to the floor, but the Senate it did not. So there's no conference, there's no bill yet, but the Senate is talking about moving on that in the near future. The other is the First in the World program, and this could actually go under both Department of Ed and Congress. Since the President's FY14 budget has provided potential opportunities for badges, and they proposed this First in the World program, which would provide funding to support, in part, projects to develop third-party validation systems that identify competencies, assessments, and curricula for specific fields. So again, the word badges isn't there overtly, but this is an opportunity for federal support of badges. Now, this is just a proposal, and the budget has not been approved by Congress. And this, again, goes back to the appropriation bills and the process there and whether this program would get appropriated any funds, and then if there would be any accompanying policy. So we wanted to talk a little bit about just review again the challenges. I think we've kind of gone through that as we've worked through the slides here, but the biggest challenges, while there are these opportunities, the biggest challenges still are congressional gridlock. Another is the tight federal budget. So with some of these new programs that are being introduced, with ARPA Ed, with First in the World, there's not really an appetite for new funding or new programs. And so as Danica mentioned, incorporating into I3 the notion of ARPA Ed is a more likely scenario than getting a separate ARPA Ed program. So those are things that will present challenges as policy is worked through Congress. Another challenge is that the current education system, and I mentioned this briefly when talking about competency-based learning, is that it's focused on brick and mortar and clock and calendar. So that's commonly referred to as seat time as well, with the clock and calendar, where students are required to be in the school, in their classroom, in a grade for a certain amount of time. But the current system does not really allow for students to learn at their own pace. Students, who are excelling at a subject still have to sit in the same classroom and finish the year's worth of study, as opposed to moving ahead or diving deeper into their interests. But there are examples of places where the system is kind of being put to the test or being stretched, so that we're not so focused on clock and calendar, but again, looking at that competency-based learning. And some of you are working on that. PASA is a good example of how they're looking at the learning that's happening outside of the traditional school day and tying it to academic achievement within the school. The other challenge that we see is with digital technology and the use of different forms of learning, I think, is that schools and teachers are not given the support that they need. So part of it is the digital infrastructure piece, but another part is the professional development, so that educators actually know how to effectively use the technology, so that it's not just access, but it's about participation with the technology in order to improve student achievement. And finally, the last challenge that we've identified here is increased privacy and safety concerns. So, as we're looking at using technology to improve education, common fear is from both parents and from schools that privacy and safety concerns. So if data is being shared now between informal and formal education institutions, how is that data sharing happening? Who's owning the data? What does that mean to student privacy? All of these issues kind of get heightened because there is a little bit of a lack of understanding of what the use of technology can mean in the schools, and so there are efforts underway to explore this. The Aspen Institute, with support from the MacArthur Foundation, has instituted the Task Force on Learning and the Internet, which is a group of 20 thought leaders from business, industry, academics, schools, informal education settings like libraries, who are coming together to really explore these ideas and to look more closely at what are the real privacy and safety concerns, how do they address them, and how do they improve the use of technology and digital learning for students.
And I think that I just want to put one more pin in that, is that as you work on implementing badges, particularly as it relates to K-12 education, for those of you doing that, I can't underscore enough if you haven't found it already, you will, how the reaction around privacy and safety will be. There will be people who say there are so many things we just cannot do because of internet filtering, or FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights Privacy and Protection Act, which is a federal law that really puts some walls up around what you can do with student data. And the lawyers in these systems will immediately in most cases, respond with, don't do anything. It's better to do nothing than to get into a privacy litigation issue. Or parents say, I just don't want my kid marketed to, even though there's all kinds of research, and most of our fixes are limiting, most of the policy fixes in this area are limiting the ability of children to use the internet effectively for learning. So we don't have any answers, which is why she mentioned the Aspen work. But the notion that you will run into this, I'd be shocked if you didn't at some point. So after we do the boohoo, terrible world out there, there are real opportunities. I think we feel like the world is changing, and Karen and I have been working on these issues for a while now, and I think we feel more excited about this kind of effort than we have in a long time, that there is actually really interest, and we actually failed to, I should also add a trend here just on competency-based education, and I'll fill in around that a little bit, but this is really a couple things here to leave you with. One is that you can't just assume people understand the value, interest, the why, the where, the what of badges. It's still a very new concept to most people, whether in policy or practice, and the real notion around badges being something more and deeper than just what you might think of as a Girl Scout badge is really difficult for people to grasp. It takes a while. So Mozilla and MacArthur are helping by trying to create some basic briefs and other information to try to help with the broader outreach and education understanding of what these things are. But, you know, I think that all of you need to be thinking about as you implement this, and in the good of the sort of long-term order for badges and this kind of work, is really building into what you're doing the case making. So it's not just the why and the where now, but a year from now, what are you going to be able to say that was accomplished? How many children, you know, were able to use this somewhere and it meant something to somebody? How much, you know, whatever the context, how many workers, you know, were able to get promoted or retrained and got jobs? You know, some really tangible outcomes should be part of everything you're doing, so that the story you're telling longer term starts to be the most attractive answer to all of the policy trends and the practices and outcomes that people are challenged with on the ground. So I encourage you to be thinking about that all along. And the trends, again, sort of recapping, but again, I want to make sure we understand why they're real opportunities, because we didn't sort of focus on that before. But the partnership piece is that schools are going to be, in many cases, feel they're the best at reading math, science, the basic academics. But as the demand grows for skills other than that, there is going to be more and more need for partnerships and organizations of many different kinds that can offer capacities, interests, and content for those partnerships to advance student learning so that they're more able to graduate college and career ready, which is really the standard now. Are going to be critical. Personalized learning, again, as now that we know that that's really, at least federally, meaning talking about a digital aspect, what more could bring a student, or at any age, a personalized learning infrastructure than badges that can tell the story of what that student knows and be able to do. So there's huge potential there. The digital infrastructure piece, again, we reference it because it's something that you're all going to have to address, but the opportunities coming along behind you around Connected and others that we can all talk about, that there's going to be more digital infrastructure capacity in the future, we hope, and that we're all going to try to work towards that, can help answer some of those questions for people who might doubt that there's the infrastructure to do these kinds of things. And the expanded learning opportunities, we talked a little bit about it, but many times the place where partnerships are most accepted today are around expanding learning, and really that is about more time, but it's more time spent well and more time that matters. So the Providence After School work, PASA's work, is a great example of where they took their work in expanded learning outside the school day, their partnership with the schools, built that real partnership into a badge conversation that then led to children getting credit for the time they spent in PASA outside the regular school day through badges. And again, that's just a pilot sort of. It's one of the first out there doing this, but those are the kinds of things that expanded learning opportunities can offer, because at least right now, more so than the traditional academics, that's a place where people accept that there's a lot of players, a lot of different content, a lot of different skills being addressed. And then the competency-based issue is really fundamental, and from a federal, even state policy perspective, the idea of transitioning from seat time or hours spent, 50 minutes in history, 50 minutes in math, 50 minutes in reading, to a competency-based system is a huge, enormous transition. But I have never seen it talked about more. The idea has been around for decades. The actual, I think, foothold on it is actually starting to come about, and you've got a lot of people coming at it from different angles. There's sort of the digital side of it, which digital is part of the answer to that, but there's the budget side, where if you don't have to have 100 kids sitting for 50 minutes in history every day, and in fact some could race through it and get through earlier, and you could spend more time with the ones who need it. There's some real budget and learning and impacts around that. And then just the way we know that the world works in the workplace, we don't work in these we work in competency-based settings. And so that's the sort of obvious, almost practical answer to all of this. So we're seeing, as Kara talked about the actual policies, but we're seeing that some states are doing experiments with competency-based education and starting to do away with the Carnegie unit or seat time, and doing experimenting about how you make that still work in a system where all kids have to graduate under the same standards. It's tricky, but there's some experimenting and piloting going on, which is going to fuel a lot of the conversations. And then finally, another lens that we take to this is how much is private or philanthropic world caring about these issues. So if you've got the federal government sort of dipping their toe in the water on a bunch of these issues, you've got obviously all of you doing innovation on the ground, and others trying to work through things in states or districts. There's significant interest by philanthropy and business in these areas too. Business more around competency-based and moving through the Common Core and all of that, so the digital aspect is related to that. But on philanthropy, we've got some pretty big stakeholders who do a lot of work in these areas. So obviously you all are very aware of sort of Mozilla and MacArthur's work in badges specifically, but if you look at these trends, you've got places like Wallace Foundation that is highly focused on expanded learning and citywide systems for serving students. So how do you connect all the institutions in a city so that students move throughout them and get anytime, anywhere, all the support they need? Huge potential for things like badges, and they really come at it from the expanded learning time and system change aspects of it. The Gates Foundation was a core initial funder of a lot of the Common Core development work, and is very interested in seeing it come to fruition. And they spend a lot of money on that and are continuing to look at all of the challenges they face in implementation, which includes digital pieces. But they also have a real innovation fund, and they're really interested in badges-like things and competency-based answers in their innovation side. And some of those conversations are starting to come together, and they may not look at it exactly the same. None of these foundations look at any of this exactly the same way, but again, if you look at language and trends, they're trending towards similar issues. Carnegie Foundation has shown some interest in this, the innovation and badges, and sort of the types of things like badges, not badges specifically so much, but the kinds of innovations around digital aspect in education that needs to happen. And even some of a little more out of the specific language, but the Hewlett Foundation, for example, has a thing called deeper learning. But what the real core of that is, it's that we can't just assess students based on reading and math once a year, that we have to have time for them to go deep into content and to go deep into 21st century skills. Well, to me, that's highly related to this agenda. So if you were able to sort of make them all talk in the same vocabulary, I think we'd all find that they're all leaning towards this. They're all sort of actually very aligned. They just like to have their own names for everything in their own agendas, which we all do. So that just gives you a sense, and not that there's specific grants available for any of that. Again, we're not here today to talk about specific funding opportunities, but we're hopefully helped give some context for the latest in education, national speak and policy, and some of the language that's commonly being used around that might help you as you develop relationships for either funding or practice. So we're happy to turn it over to questions.
I'm going to give people just a couple minutes to get themselves out of deep mute. Ruby, do you want to explain how to ask questions?
Yes, I can't unmute everybody all at once, but I'm happy to do it on demand. So you can use the raise hand feature in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can unmute you, or you can also use the questions window to send a chat message at me to get unmuted. And of course, you can always use the Chatzy chat, which is, well, I'll pull up my screen if that's helpful. You can see that.
So while we wait for people, if they have questions, and by the way, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was really, I think, I know a couple people have asked if this is going to be recorded, and I think people will be interested in listening to it asynchronously if they couldn't make it today. But one thing I just wanted to ask about, and I know this came up at one of our meetings, the question was asked about what do you think will happen when I think this was right before Obama was voted in for his second term. Are there opportunities that change or some that stay the same if the administration changes that you see?
I think keeping the administration obviously has a different Obama has continued to serve his legacy, but I think if we saw a Republican administration, there'd be a lot more focus on choice types of things, whether that's more charter schools, more public school choice generally, potentially private school choice. I think that has continued to be a core element of any reform. I also think that of the Republican agenda, I also think that we used to say that it would be more flexibility and more up to the locals of how to address things. But this administration, the Obama administration, has really messed that message up for everybody, because they've offered a whole bunch of waivers, and they continue to offer waivers of federal policy. So it becomes much harder to understand exactly what we mean by flexibility. So I hesitate to actually make that one of our standbys like it used to be. But I will say around, around the piece about choice, when it comes to charter schools, they're actually highly popular in both Democrat and Republican policymakers now. I mean, this administration has championed charter schools. There's some that love them, some that hate them, some that are agnostic on them, but there's this strong interest in charters being a place of innovation. And they are already by nature freed of a lot of the same confines that other public schools have. So if you're looking for K-12 type partners, charters might be a place, at least from the flexibility side, to do some of the innovative work.
Great, thank you. I have gotten some questions. One of them, I'm waiting for clarification on the acronym, but maybe you'll know what it is. Alex Molina from PASA, he's on the webinar, and he's asking, has anyone used CTE funding to expand their digital badges work? I'm not sure what CTE stands for.
CTE?
Yeah, CTE is Career and Technical Education. I don't know if there's been any uses of funds through CTE for badges. Specifically, my gut is telling me no at this point, but that's something that we can look into and see if there have been any uses. But it is a flexible pot of funding, but I don't know. So that's not, so badges may not be prohibited. I just don't know if there's, I just don't know if there's been any uptake of the funds for that.
And that might actually be a question more for all of you to each other, which is if any of you have worked, CTE predominantly goes to high schools. So if you're working with high schools and they were able to leverage some of their CTE funds, that certainly is a potential, because, career and technical schools look very different from the old ones, but they're still focusing on workforce career tracks.
Yeah, if anybody wants to chime in Chatsy, feel free to go ahead. And then there's a question from Matt Richardson in Chatsy. Of course, the biggest stumbling block people are encountering is funding. Is there a direct way to approach foundations supporting badge learning like Gates? I'm not sure if you want to take that one or.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that all is both yes and no. So yes, I mean, I think they're very interested in this kind of thing. In terms of directly approaching them, it's about, if there isn't some specific ask, then it's about relationships. So it would be a matter of working through that. And potentially, I mean, larger efforts amongst, if there was some larger, I know that Gates helped to fund some of this work, right, Cheryl, already?
Yep. We have
there's
5
some
projects in our initiative that have been funded by Gates, and then they funded the last research competition. And I think that's probably going to be the way it works, that a lot of foundations aren't going to, approaching them directly is not a very this outcome is not likely to be successful, because a lot of them have mechanisms for publicly funding through organizations like Haystack, and Next Generation Learning Challenge is a challenge / competition that's where they're moving their agenda forward. I knew there was going to be a funding question that was going to come up. And the best thing to do is just have your development people to be as active as possible, and we try on Haystack to put up what kind of opportunities we see. And I think the bigger thing that I'm hearing from you, Danica and Kara, is that be very cognizant of the language that you're using in some of these grants, particularly the government ones, personalized learning, and just understanding that there's a lexicon happening when people are reviewing these applications. We do have another question from Dan Hickey. He's asking if you can elaborate on another acronym here, OVAE, Digital Badges Study. None of the subcontractors I knew got funding, and all I can find is some summary stuff from AIR. Do you know who the lead is?
We saw there was a person posted, at least for the grant lead on that, and we can email you, Cheryl, and Dan, I think we've met before, but we don't know specifically, but I also know that part of that work is there's an advisory group, and I think Mozilla is involved in that advisory group. So to me, the best way would be to find our friends and ask more about it.
Yeah, good idea. Matt is asking if they can have a PDF copy of the presentation.
Yeah, sure. We can send that to you, Cheryl, and get it out.
And I'll send it out to everybody on the list.
And also, for those of you interested in the Aspen piece, it's aspentaskforce.org is the link. And you may be interested in signing up to be part of the listserv, the community. And over time, there's going to be opportunities to offer ideas to the task force, and as all of you are interested in related areas, you may want to do that. Yeah, Aspen with one T, not Aspect. Yeah, that's good. Okay, AspenTaskForce.org.
Yes, the second one in there. Thank you, Ruby.
No problem.
So do we have any other questions from people? I think this is, I have a feeling that a lot of people were writing furiously to, not sure if they were going to get a copy of the presentation or not, because this is the first time we've had so few questions, and I know it's because people are hanging on to this very carefully. So if anybody has follow-up questions, email me and I can forward those to Danica and Kara. And I think I'm going to post follow-up to this on Haystacks if there's conversations or comments. This is a lot to take in for a group. I think this is the kind of thing you go back to your organization and convey this information. So if we don't have any more questions for people, I'm just going to rattle on for a couple seconds here while I say thank you, but if anybody has a couple questions, feel free to interrupt. But Danica and Kara, I can't thank you enough. I was really looking forward to this, and I know I got a lot of emails from people saying that this is exactly what they wanted. This is the kind of conversation they wanted to have. So thank you so much for sharing a whole hour of your busy lives with us and all this good information. And on behalf of all of our grantees, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us. It was great.
All right, everybody. Lots of thank yous and Chatsy. We will we'll be sending up a follow-up with a recap of today's webinar. Thanks, everybody.